friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started.
Hey Forward Rewind podcast listeners, Blair Hicks here again with you today. I have Pastor Derek here and Pastor Daryl. Go ahead and say hi, guys.
Bonjour.
Ooh, I like that. Okay, so we are diving into, this is week 3 of Exodus.
Week 4?
I really feel like I should know this.
Week 4.
Week 4 of Exodus. God is able is our topic. We are going to talk about a lot of stuff. We're going to get a little bit weird, and we're going to crank it up a little to a little rating of PG-13. If you were listening to the messages, you will know what I'm talking about. Which I know you guys are really excited to talk about this. Yeah, I know I am. But you'll have to this has to be a serious podcast because you can't make me laugh really hard or smile because I actually had some dental work done yesterday and my one side is really sore. So if you guys could just be really boring today, I'd really appreciate it.
Thank you for giving me a goal to work towards.
Okay, good. Oh. Yeah, I kind of shot myself in the foot there, didn't I?
Shouldn't have said anything.
Yeah. Ow. See, you already did it. Daryl, I have to thank you for being open about your, I don't want to be like your lack of interest in the Olympics when you were, were very forward about it. And when you said it, it felt freeing because I was like, me too.
Yeah.
And I made them
a safe space.
Yeah, it's a safe space.
You're allowed.
And I made the mistake once of telling someone that, and you wouldn't believe the disgust they had towards me. And
people get pretty passionate.
They get passionate, and he was like, how dare you? You're not a Canadian. And so I never told anybody else that again. And then you said that, and I was like, me
okay.
too.
All right. I'm just gonna throw this out here now. Okay. If you only get excited about a sport once every 4 years, you might not be a real fan.
I fully, wholeheartedly agree with that statement.
Okay.
These aren't even sports.
Well, okay.
No,
so I thought,
but if you enjoy swimming, then watch swimming. If you enjoy gymnastics, watch gymnastics. But Derek, you watch the Jays only once every 4 years, right?
No.
I automatically assumed that you were an Olympics person, Derek, because you're a sports person and you're a guru.
I don't care about the Olympics.
No. Okay, so we're in good company then.
Especially things that are the judged sports.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah.
If I can't tell whether you're better than somebody else by watching, then I have to wait for somebody else to give me a score on what you did. I don't want to watch it.
What is great though, in Europe, they do a diving competition, but it is how crazy of a dive you can do. And that thing's like a party and there's music going on and it's insane.
Do they consider it a sport?
The guys who are jumping, they probably consider themselves elite athletes in the moment until they hit the water and it just looks painful.
Belly flop.
It's basically a belly flop competition, but how many flips you can do.
I would watch that. I would watch that for sure.
And that is just by the crowd, just by judging by the cheers of how loud they get.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is do any of us actually know anybody who does any of those things that they do? What is the size of the pool that you're competing against for real? How many of us have ever even had a chance to go bobsledding? You're competing against the 10 other people in the world who bobsled.
Right. I have thought of that for sure.
There's actually a really interesting argument about this that in particular for the Winter Olympics, that it is, to get a little controversial here, it actually is something where you have to be fairly wealthy to actually compete.
Right.
I do not have the financial means to go to a ski hill every single day to train, right? And so you have these people who are, quote, the most elite athletes, but there is like a wealth barrier in order to even compete in certain Olympic sports. And so I find that interesting of there's a world stage. Let's see all these countries, who is the best. I'm like, it's a little bit also who has, mom and dad who can afford to pay for all this. And I actually know someone who his dad basically embezzled money to afford that he could train to become an Olympic athlete. He never made it, but it's so crazy expensive to even try to compete at that level.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That kind of sours the experience a little bit for me as well.
I mean, I am certain that we have offended multiple people with this with this confession. So to those that are offended, I'm sorry. You can email me at blairh@forwardchurch.ca. However, the full confession is that I didn't even know the Winter Olympics were on. But at the same time, my entire world is potty training and children's shows right now. So that is my excuse. I would love to start, as we always do, where each of you give us a synopsis of your message and the main takeaways. Let's jump over to Derek to start there.
Yeah, the synopsis is basically the title.
Yeah.
That God is able. And when we come up against things or God calls us into stuff, it's not about our abilities, but it's about a God who is able. So our past, our current abilities really aren't the issue at hand. It's, are we going to trust in the God who is calling us to act and to be obedient in faithfulness to him?
Daryl, you guys were quite parallel this week.
Were we?
Do you
That's
have?
good.
Yeah.
All right.
Do you have any? Do you have a synopsis of your message and the takeaways?
Yeah, I can give one. My synopsis, my big takeaway was when God calls us to follow him, he actually equips us for his service. And I think that's the big thing I really want people to understand is that, God is going to give you exactly what you need in order to serve and obey him. And so I talked about how God, he's able to use what you have, what you say. He's even able to use your doubts and your mistakes, that we need to fully trust that God is the one who is able. And often we kind of get into our own heads. We think, I'm not sure about myself. I'm not sure if I'm able to fulfill the thing that God is calling me to. But just like Moses, we have to just go on faith and trust that God is the one who's actually able. So we're not trusting in ourselves, but we're trusting in the one who's sending us.
So then going off of what you said about us looking at ourselves and trying to do stuff ourselves, why do you think Moses and us are always looking at ourselves and we always seem to forget that God is able and that he is the center of it? Because I think that we often don't even realize that we're doing it, but it seems like it's like our fleshly default to just zoop, we take the lens and we put it back onto ourselves. Why do you think we're doing that? Why does Moses do that? Why are we doing that?
We are kind of egocentric by nature, right? I mean,
sure.
Blair, you have, and Daryl too, you have 2 young kids at home. You don't have to teach a kid to think about themselves. But it's a lot of work in parenting to begin to help your children think outside of themselves, right? In fact, even in the developmental process, it's kind of like junior high is when you start to realize that there are people who are experiencing things outside of you and that you're not the center of everybody else's universe. So that's our natural default as kind of fallen, selfish human beings is our gaze always turns to ourselves. On Sunday, I talked about the fact that Moses's journey was really, his issue was that when he was 40, he was focused on himself and what he was going to do. And now he's 80 and he's still kind of focused on himself. It's just, he's gone from self-confidence to self-doubt.
2 extremes.
Yep.
Anything to add, Daryl?
Yeah, I was just going to agree. I think it is our default. Absolutely. And it's really hard to break free from that. I think part of this is kind of ourselves and our experience. It's kind of like that's like what's on TV, and God's like what's on radio. It's like this is like what's more easy to see and experience, like myself, my abilities. But God doesn't show up in exactly the same ways, and I think that's an aspect when we talk about having faith in God. Like it's okay. Like, is God actually going to take care of this situation? And it's like this, I think Craig Groeschel, he put it really well this way. It's like we have all these worries, all these concerns in like this big, huge box, and it's like overflowing with all these concerns. And it's like, okay, God, I'm going to give this all over to you. We place it down for 1 second, and we're like, oh, you didn't do anything with it. And you pick it back up. And you're like, all right, I have this now. And we say that's faith, but that isn't it. Leaving it there for 1 second, actually laying it down and saying, God, like, I'm giving this fully over to you. But that's really hard to do. Even in Moses's example, I mean, God is really showing him in spectacular ways that he is with him. And I mean, it covers 3 chapters. Like, this isn't a short conversation. God is having to draw him closer to him. And I really think it's the same thing for us. Like, it can take not just a conversation, but a lifetime of God drawing us closer so we can more fully understand that he is there with us.
So I feel like you kind of already answered the next question then, which was, to move our eyes from ourselves and our circumstances to the abilities and the power of God, of the God that we serve sounds great, but how do we actually do that? And you kind of answered that in saying drawing near to God. And, you even said that can take a lifetime. When I thought of the question, I thought of prayer, but that's another way that we can draw closer to God. Do you have other ways to explain of how we can actually do this, turning our eyes onto God and his ability and taking it away from ourselves?
Yeah, I think, when we engage in corporate worship together, we sing together like that. That's part of, just turning my eyes and reminding myself of who God is when I open up scripture, when I go out in nature and kind of go out with maybe not sticking earbuds in my ears and going to listen, but actually like experiencing nature and looking at the grandeur of what God has created. David does that, right? And his eyes are turned to how big and how majestic and how creative God is through those things. So it really is about practicing some of these spiritual disciplines that, Daryl's been doing a class on, has done a class on practicing spiritual disciplines. Part of that is shaping us to get our eyes off of ourselves.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that just jumping off of that, Derek, we've talked about this a lot lately about worship and the level of importance of it, but how it's easy, or for some, it's easy to kind of put it on the back burner. And, we talked about on Sundays, getting ready in the morning and getting to church and making our time together in worship like a huge high priority, because we need that. And it's not just a chance to listen to some good music. It's like a chance to draw close to the Lord and focus our eyes on him. And I guess we could use that as an encouragement to others to you might be somebody who flicks on your Bluetooth and you listen to worship through the week, and that's great. But like coming into a community with your brothers and sisters in Christ to worship together is a huge element for sure.
Yeah. There's something, we just had our first in-person staff meeting this morning.
Yeah.
I think we did a few in the summer of 2020, maybe.
Summer of relaxed protocols.
In giant circles.
Yeah.
But this was like the first time we could be in a room and in a much more normal situation with other than just having some masks on. But there was a power in being present, as was Tammy Bull, who shared the devotional this morning. There was a power that came in praying in an embodied prayer as we broke off into groups there is something about the embodied presence that amplifies the realness of like the worship experience.
Right.
I don't know how else to put it. I don't know if you experienced that at all this morning, Daryl, but
Yeah.
I was like, man, this is different than hearing somebody do a devotion on Zoom. And I'm thankful. Like, don't misread me. I'm so thankful for Zoom. I'm thankful that we've been able to do those things, but to actually experience the other thing, it was like, no, this is there's a more full reality here.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, technology is great. Zoom has been great, but there is something different when you can be there in person. And I've always said, I think that worship is one of the most practical things that we can do as followers of Christ. Like if you are struggling with any sense of, whether you think of it as doubt or just feeling spiritually dry, worship is incredibly important. Like so much of scripture is actually meant to draw us into God's presence, to fill us with awe. Like this is why I'm taking a course right now on the book of Revelation. Revelation is one of my favorite books, and it's not because of why some people might think it's because it's because I am convinced that Revelation is all about worship. Like every single passage is actually meant to give us a greater sense of awe and wonder of who God is. And that is why it's so important. So it kind of kills me a little bit on Sunday mornings when I see people coming in a little bit late into the service. And I think sometimes, and I don't know why we tend to view it this way, it's as long as I get there before the message, it's okay. The worship music is a little bit of it not as important, but I kind of wish we could change that mindset. It is so vital for us to be worshiping together. So that's how we take our eyes off ourselves and put it onto Christ. The other way that we do this is, I think, is actually by starting to serve. I think that this is how we take our eyes off ourselves. Because most often before you serve, your attention's on yourself of, am I able? Do I have that gifting? Do I have the time? And all these questions are kind of like, can I, what are people going to think about me if I put myself out there? But once you actually start serving, you quickly realize, hey, like it's not about you. It's, fulfilling a need, realizing giftings that God has provided. I talked on Sunday about spiritual giftings, and I think really the only way you can discover it is by starting to serve. And so that is how we draw our attention off of ourselves. And it's a helpful way to begin to focus in on Christ.
So let's talk about spiritual gifts, because you did bring it up in your message, and that's Romans 12:6, right? Did I get that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Yeah. So I kind of read the passage of spiritual gifts as like a helpful way to find out how and in what ways I can serve based on the gifts God's given me, which is what you just said. But how do these spiritual gifts relate to the reality that God could call us to things we don't feel and may very well not be equipped by ourselves for? So I don't know, when you were talking about it, I heard, oh yeah, that's really helpful. And then you told me, well, what was the phrase? You said he doesn't call those that are equipped. He equips those who are called. And then I was like, wait a second. You just told me about the spiritual gifts. Explain.
You're not supposed to poke holes into my sermon.
And we're going to end here.
There you go. All right. Derek has settled this. Okay. So, that's a great point. So, okay. I think that's the difference, I think, between relying on natural talents and spiritual gifts. So I think that we're all born, whether you're a follower of Christ or not, everyone is born with natural giftings and abilities. But a spiritual gift is something that happens once you become a follower of Christ. This is Holy Spirit empowered gifting that God gives to every believer. So in the New Testament, they make it really clear that this is something that all believers have been given, spiritual giftings. And it could be more than one. You can have numerous giftings that God has given. And I would even put it this way, for particular tasks and for particular seasons, that the Holy Spirit can give you a different gifting based upon the season of life that you are in. And so that's why I'm saying God doesn't just call the equipped. It's not just about our natural abilities, but he equips all those whom he calls to himself. And so that's where God is giving us these spiritual giftings. And so that's when I think it's really important for us to realize that we're relying on Christ during that time. Right. It's not just about my abilities to do things. It's, hey, like, I'm not able, God is able. God is the one who is able to work in and through me to accomplish his mission in the world.
Thanks for clearing that up. I was going to take it out, but I was like, no, if I'm asking this question, somebody else might have this question too.
Oh, it's good.
So let's get personal, guys. We're going to get personal.
Sure.
This isn't the PG-13 part yet. Maybe it is. I don't know. Whatever you guys want to. I want to I want to know, have you ever, okay, so we see a bunch of times Moses protests, right? God asks him to do something and he's like, please, no, right? Even Daryl, you kind of said he's looking for excuses. He starts looking for excuses. So I want to know if you have ever offered up repeated objections to God's plan, maybe something he was asking you to do. And how did God respond to your objections, and what did he reveal about his character to you?
Many times in my life. So my spiritual journey started really young. I came to faith, grew up in church, grew up in a Christian home, and really come to a point of faith when I was 5 years old. But I had a moment where I was in junior high, and God kind of grabbed a hold of me and said, hey, this is more than just about believing certain things about me and acting a certain way. Like, this is about living your life in submission to me as Lord. And I have a very clear recollection of sitting in the back of a church and having a wrestling match with God about who was going to be Lord in my life. And I was very happy to have God along for the ride in parts of my life. And I would love to have him bless me, but kind of let me kind of work out the plan for my life. And I'll just do the right things, but God, don't mess around with my plans.
Right.
And it was really in that moment where I felt God call me towards ministry, which I did not in any way, shape, or form want to head towards. In that, as I came to a point where I ended up weeping and saying, okay, Lord, if that's what you want me to do, I'll do it. In that, I still said, but I've got a few caveats about the things that I would not want to do in ministry. And one of those was, if I get into ministry, I don't want to do youth ministry. So I'm no interest in being a youth pastor. And what's the first thing I entered into outside?
I was going to say,
And I said, I don't want to be a youth pastor. And I don't want to work in a small town. My very first ministry position ended up being a youth pastor in Burford, Ontario.
Where is Burford?
Burford is a little village just outside of Brantford.
Haven't even heard of it.
There you go.
There you go. It's small.
And I can go through times where I have said qualified yeses to God. I can go through times where I knew God was pulling me towards something. Church planting was another one where I was like, yeah, I think church planting is a good thing, God. So I'll help other people plant churches. And then he kept on pushing on me and telling me, no, this is, I actually want you to go do this. And so I say, well, fine, I'll go through the assessment process. And then when they say no, I'll be able to come back to you and say, God, you got it wrong, because the assessment process says that I should not plant a church.
And instead,
it did not say that. So, absolutely. I have had those moments in my life where I've been in the spot of Moses, where I say, but Lord, I think you got this wrong.
and you learned a lot through it, as you said. Yeah. Daryl, have you had any scenarios?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been numerous times very similar to what Derek just explained of God calling me to certain things, and I gave a qualified response. It's yes, I will if I do it this way. So a few examples. A lot of this revolved around ministry. So knew again from a young age, God was calling me to ministry when I was like eight years old. It's weird when you're 8 years old and like you feel like I should be a pastor, and people are like, no, you should be like,
how about an astronaut?
You should be like try to be like a police officer, like a normal dreams. Come on. And so anyway, so like as I got a little bit older, and I started just kind of running from this call that I felt of like, I don't know. I'm like, maybe I can serve God in other ways. Maybe I can. I really like art. I really like drawing. I think I was fairly good at it, and I'm like, I want to like go and like use this ability, like some graphic design or something to that extent, and I'll serve in my church. And God just again kept on calling me, and like I knew what He was calling me to, and even when I submitted to that of like, okay, I'll go into ministry. But this was when I really got into Hillsong United, one of like their very first albums. And then I went onto their website and I realized that there's a school in Sydney, Australia where you can learn to become like a worship pastor. And I'm like, that sounds awesome. I'm going to live next to the beach. I'm going to go be part of this school.
They were going to fit him for skinny jeans right there on the spot.
Yeah.
So awesome. So awesome.
3 piercings, a tattoo, and skinny jeans, and he's set.
All the previous Hillsong attenders are offended now. We've offended many people today.
And then I went, my youth pastor at the time, he was like, I'm going to go visit a student at Heritage. And he's like, do you want to come with? I'm like, yeah, sure. The Heritage was like, way down on the list.
Right.
There's like,
What are you talking, Sydney, Australia, or Cambridge, Ontario?
I know where I'm going.
There were 2 schools on my list, and Australia was pretty high up there. Anyways, we get there, and he's like, cool, okay, you have a tour signed up, right? I'm like, no, I don't. You planned this. So my youth pastor and another guy at the school, they gave me a quick tour. It was like the worst tour ever. They're like, yeah, there's a library in that building. Dorm, that's where all the fun happens. That other building, I don't know. So that was my tour. It showed me nothing of the school. And I'm like, all right, God, I feel like I should be here. Like this is the school I should be at, and I should probably give up on Australia for real reasons. But like for more like to be more honest, like very recently had to struggle and wrestle through this of what God's calling me to. Like before I came to Forward, I had a very comfortable position at a church, and I did not really, to be really honest, I did not really want to move in the middle of a pandemic.
And a second baby on the way.
And a second baby on the way, and in school. And that did not sound like fun at all. And God just put this in front of me. I had a few friends say, hey, like you should apply, like you should seriously consider Forward. And I'm like, yeah, I love the church, the community. But I don't know, like this seems so hard right now. And I wrestled with God for a long time, and suddenly I'm like, okay, God, like you just have to like make it really clear. This is where I need to be. Cause I don't really want to sell my house right now. And God just made it really clear. He's like, this is where you're going to be. I'm like, okay, all right. Then, so, I mean, I have to sell that. Like, I love Forward. It's been so good, but part of that process was a little painful. Yeah. And it always goes back to, I heard a missionary share this way. He's actually a missionary to Russia. And he just shared once about how he didn't want to live a life that didn't require faith. And that is a phrase that goes through my mind quite often, especially when I'm facing a difficult task of, all right, well, I don't want to live a life that is reliant on me, because that seems like a subpar type of life. I want to live a life that truly requires faith, that God is going to take care of it. So, we moved without having anything lined up here yet. And God has been good. God has been so good.
So both of you kind of shared scenarios where God's ability and the fact that he's able and he makes plans, while that sounds nice and should maybe bring us comfort, it sounds like maybe perhaps it brought some discomfort for you. So that's the question. Does the realization and acceptance that we can't thwart God's plans and nothing is beyond his abilities bring you comfort, or perhaps maybe even a sense of warning?
Both.
Yeah.
Right,
I think that's
both.
the answer.
Yeah. I think there is a great deal of comfort when you're with God and you're walking in the way that he's called you to know, like, it's not on me, right? There's a huge relief and release in that God's got this. But there's also discomfort because we don't always want to get on board with God's plan, and you should be uncomfortable if you're outside of God's plan.
That's a good.
Because if you're outside of God's plan, you're out there on your own.
On your own abilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think part of that is how we think about and how we define comfort in our lives. Because often we think of comfort as when I'm not being challenged, when I'm in a perfectly safe location in my life. But that's not the type of comfort that God is offering to us. That, as Derek said, like, there's this comfort in knowing that you are right in the middle of God's plan, right where he wants you to be. And I don't know why, but I just have like this picture, this analogy in my mind right now, probably because I was just talking with someone about rock climbing, but this idea of like you're climbing up and it's not comfortable, but you know, this is where you're supposed to be. Like, you know, the positions that you're finding yourself in, like that's the best spot for you to be on that wall as you're climbing up. And perhaps that's a helpful way to think through how God leads us. It's not always the safest and most comfortable, but you can know that you are following God's path for your life.
I know, I mean, when you're not in it, it's easy to say, oh, I find comfort in it. And I do, but I think the most comfort that I get from knowing his ability and that I can't thwart his plans is what your number 4 point was, Daryl, that God can use our mistakes. Because I think we can really, I know myself, I can really dwell on my mistakes and they can eat at me and even make me think that like I made things worse or I really messed up God's plans. But I think sometimes we need to stop the dwelling and just hand it over to God and his power, since, you know, he's able and we can't thwart his, and I go back to my previous job and like how I really messed up the whole twinkle in the eye of living out, you know, a life that I thought was, you know, showing them God's love. And instead, I think I put a sour taste in their mouth towards Christians. Like, and I would dwell on that. I would really think about it a lot, but I'm like, no, God, this whole message was like, no, he can use my mistakes. I didn't mess it up. I didn't do great, but I didn't mess it up. He can fix it and he can use it. That was the most comforting part I got from that. But when you're in it, for sure, I like your rock climbing analogy. It's uncomfortable, but also comfortable knowing you're headed in the right direction. Mm-hmm. So I don't know about you guys, but as I was reading this chunk of Exodus, we were talking about how God is able. There was a ton of other traits that really jumped out at me, traits of God, characteristics of God. Like his patience with his protests and his authority. We talked about the snake, right? Mm-hmm. I have questions about your Belize trip, but maybe we'll save that for another time. So I guess I want to know what other aspects of God's character stood out to you when you were preparing for this week?
That's a good question, Blair. His grace stood out to me. When we get to the part where Moses is still like, yeah, God, I don't think I'm the right guy for this. And God says, well, how about Aaron at least? Like, Aaron's coming here. And that's God's grace to Moses. Moses is just like unwillingness to, he's talking to a bush.
Yeah.
The bush is on fire and talking to him, and he's still like doubting and hesitating, right? And it says that the Lord's anger was kindled towards Moses, and I think we kind of see that later on. But we also see that he makes allowance for Moses's really lack of faith in that. Mm-hmm. and Aaron gets brought into the picture. Now, I think we're going to see later on, though, there'll be consequences that come along from that. Aaron gets into some stuff here, but it's God's grace to Moses that he doesn't just strike him down on the spot and say, I'm going someplace else.
Yeah. Yeah. Because he could have at the first no.
Yeah.
Like, who says no to a burning bush that's not, right?
That has now taken a staff,
Right.
turn it into a serpent, taken a hand that's made it leprous, then healed it, and taken water and turned it into blood.
Yeah.
And Moses still like,
no,
think I'll pass.
Yeah, please don't make me. It's true. And I can't help but read the part about snake and grabbing the tail. And I'm like, wait a second. You'll say no to a burning bush. But when he tells you to grab a snake's tail, you're like, okay. I mean, I'm sure there's parts of that I couldn't help but wonder what is going through his head. I think that a lot about stuff.
It just goes, I think what it goes to show, Blair, is how focused we are on ourselves.
Yeah.
Like how much our own inabilities can capture us, limit us, keep us from walking in faithful obedience. Mm-hmm. Because God is showing over and over again that he is a God of power. And I don't think that Moses is necessarily doubting God's power, but his own flaws, failings, and inabilities are so front and center to him that he can't get past those things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, how many of us can relate to that?
Yeah.
And that just goes back to the point that human nature is the same.
Yeah.
God's the same, but so is human nature.
Yeah.
Did anything pop out to you?
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to what I said on Sunday of Moses was so doubting himself, he couldn't even see God's power right there in front of us, right there in front of him. The thing that stood out to me as I was studying, I love how in verse 11 it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, who made man's mouth and who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord?"
Yeah, I like that line too.
And like a few things come into my mind there. If you have read or watched the movie Lord of the Rings, I think it's Bilbo Baggins is worried that Gandalf is going to steal his ring, and Gandalf all of a sudden like he kind of gets like bigger and like the room like darkens and like all these things, and he has to like show Bilbo like some of his power. He's kind of flexing there for a moment, and he just says to him, "I'm not here to rob you." And you get this sense of if he wanted to rob him, he was this little hobbit man, and Gandalf like could have taken that and taken the ring and everything, but he wasn't. He's trying to draw him in. And that imagery is what pops into my mind here of God is like getting up into Moses's face. He's like, do you not understand who you're talking to? God spoke not just to Moses this way, but also spoke to Job and his friends the exact same way. They're complaining and debating back and forth why Job had gone through so much terrible experiences, and all of a sudden God shows up and he's like, who do you guys think you are? Like, don't you understand who I am, my sovereignty, my control? Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? And so I love this picture of just God's power and sovereignty over all things. And again, it also reveals his patience to Moses through all that. Then Moses says, but send someone else. and then God gets angry. And, it's amazing how patient God is, not just with Moses. Like we see this in our lives as well. It's so important for us to take our eyes off ourselves. And I've been in that funk before where all I can think about is my own failings, my own mistakes. And I've had friends say like, hey, like don't focus on yourself. And it's so hard not to. And that's why I think it's so important for us to be constantly living in a community to help where others can help point us to Christ, to spend time in the Word, where again, that's just going to be speaking to our souls constantly about the God that we're following.
Let's go from G-rated to PG-13, because I know that there are listeners with questions.
If they waited this long, we owed it to them.
Right? It's only fair. All right. So I have this massive list of questions. No, I'm just kidding. Derek's like, oh my gosh, please don't make me answer these. I'm kidding. But I mean, we do have to touch on it. Okay. So There is a section of Exodus 4.
Just cut to it.
Okay.
Just cut to it,
I like
Blair.
what you did there, Derek. I follow along there. All right. So there's a section of this chapter that seems way out in left field, where Moses is on his way and his wife, God shows up and is about to kill him. And Zipporah takes a flint knife and circumcises her son. And then she throws his foreskin at his feet and then says, "Now you are a bridegroom of blood to me." And at the feet of Moses, and says that, and we're all left going, huh? So, I mean, I already learned what a flint knife was. Thank you for that earlier. Although it just made the story
Sharp
worse,
stone knife.
not scissors.
Nope.
So you gave us a brief explanation, Derek, on why the people of Abraham were instructed by God to be circumcised in the first place. Is there like a 1 or 2 liner reason is that you could? So
This was the external sign of the covenant that God had made with Abraham. And so all of his descendants, as a mark of this covenant between him and Abraham's descendants, were to be circumcised on the 8th day. That's back in Genesis 17.
So here we are, and they're on their way. And clearly we are finding out that Moses did not have his son circumcised.
Nope.
Why do you think Moses decided not to circumcise his son? He couldn't have just forgotten?
No, I think there's a lot of things we're not going to be able to say here. So I just want to say that off the bat. Some things will be speculation. Some things are best guesses. And some things so for example, we don't even know who was struck down. The text does not tell us whether it was Gershon or whether it was Moses.
Right.
So then we don't know who the foreskin, whose foot it got placed on. We don't know who Zipporah is referring to when she says bridegroom of blood. That's all not clear in the text. It could be either or, and it can change your understanding of it a little bit, but not the big understanding of it. So, what was your question again, Blair? I'm just thinking about all the things we don't know.
I know. Why do you think he decided not to?
I think the thing that we do know here is that Moses has not properly raised his son within the covenant. Whether he's raised him Egyptian or whether he's raised him Midianite, probably raised him in the customs of the Midianites, whom that's where his tribe had become, right? Like he marries into the daughter of a Midianite priest, raises his son out there, and so likely he is raising his son according to the Midianite customs.
So would it be speculation to say, like, why did he decide not to? Like, we don't really necessarily know why.
We don't know, but we know that he is not. He has not walked in obedience to the covenant of that he's been called to as a descendant of Abraham.
Right. So he learned a lesson in about obedience from this incident.
And the question there is that I'm kind of thinking through is, does Moses feel like he's no longer part of the covenant?
Could be.
Or is he taking himself out of the covenant?
Yep.
I think it has to be one of those, as I thought through it, of either because he failed so poorly in Egypt trying to rescue the Israelites, maybe he felt like God wasn't with him and he's not part of it, or he's taking himself out. Either way, it leads to disobedience of God's command. I think either way, it's pretty clear they know what was supposed to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing. Zipporah knows what's supposed to happen. Right. So it may have even been one of those issues where it's a parenting disagreement, because Zipporah does not see herself as she sees herself as a Midianite, not a Hebrew.
Right.
And she wants to raise her son as a Midianite, not a Hebrew. And maybe,
or is it the other way? Maybe she wanted to.
Could be.
And he disagreed.
What we do know is that she knows what ought to have happened according to Hebrew tradition, right? Because she doesn't hesitate.
Yeah.
She gets that knife and it's chop, chop right away.
Yikes. So you're right. We really don't know a lot about this, but what I think, and Jen Wilkin had sort of a one-liner lesson here.
Yep.
And that was to take away, which was disobeying God is not safe. Following him is safe.
Yep.
And that was sort of the let's just take what we need to from this and like keep going.
Yeah, I think it's an illustration of the fact that outside of the covenant is ultimately death and judgment, and inside of the covenant is life and fullness.
All right. There's your weirdness for the week, guys. I mean, we could keep going if you want. I still have lots of questions. let's cut it off there, Derek.
Yeah,
There we go.
I think just one thing I'll add into it is
Daryl's got a picture that he's drawn of the
He's going
situation.
to do an illustration.
Yeah, using his drawing skills, he's drawn this out for us.
thankfully not. No. As I've talked with a few people about like, why is this in here? Why is it so weird? All that kind of stuff. I think one thing that we also need to recognize is that like the Old Testament, like the book of Exodus, isn't written by like modern day historical type of lens of how to like answer every single question that you want to have answered in there. And so I think that's a helpful, in my own mind, like that's a helpful way of like, why doesn't it explain more? Well, this kind of just jumps out off the page of like being different than the rest of everything else that's going on. And I think that's helpful to seeing like this is actually, we're reading like a really ancient text in front of us. This is not something written 10 years ago. This is written thousands of years ago, and it's written with a purpose. And so I think we've already talked about that of why this is here is to reveal the need for obedience, how incredibly important that is. But it's not written with the same way that we would write a story like we would today.
Right.
And that has to be fair. Like we have to take it from its own cultural setting and say, hey, that's just how they wrote history back then. A little different than maybe how we would do it today. And we have to be okay with that. So I just thought of that as I've talked with a few people wondering like, why is that in there the way it is? And I find that aspect kind of helpful.
Well, thanks for taking part in the weirdness of that section. I mean, we probably could have had a whole podcast on that, but we won't. You're welcome. Let's wrap up here. I did. There's still so many things I wanted to touch on, like the Holy Spirit, and like somebody said, well, if I had the staff of God in my hands, I'd feel better about it too. And it's like, wait a second. Like you have the Holy Spirit now, isn't that? And like, I mean, we can get into the circumcision, and I mean, we still can if you guys want to, but
we don't have time, Blair.
We don't have time. Okay, so then let me instead. Before Keith gives me a stink eye for time. Oh, I just got it. I can't look at it. Okay, let's instead give you guys the platform, and you can touch on the Holy Spirit and whatnot if you want, but I just want to give you a chance to leave your listeners with something as we go on, considering what we've learned this week. So who wants to, Derek, you want to start?
Sure.
What do you want to leave your listeners with?
I just want to leave anybody who's listening with this reality that if you sense God calling you into something, don't let you be the excuse for why you don't act in obedience, and trust in what he has revealed about himself, not just through the text that we walked through this week, but that what he has revealed himself about himself ultimately in the person of Jesus Christ, that he is able. And Blair, you point out, it doesn't mean it's going to be comfortable or easy, but it is going to be the best, and he will be with you 100% of the way as you walk in faithful obedience. I don't know what you're facing. I don't know what you're up against. I don't know what God is calling you into, but I know that he's able.
I love that. Daryl?
Yeah. I think often when we think about Exodus and Moses, we look at the end of his life, where he is the one who frees Israel from slavery. He's the one who is there to part the Red Sea. And this is a low moment in Moses' life at the burning bush. As you read this, I really pick up on the fact that he is a broken and hurting man. And so I think that that's the main thing I want people to take away from this, is that Moses, he had a lot of self-doubt right now. And you might have some doubts too. You might just have some doubts about who God is and his role in your life. And I just want to give everyone just reassurance that even there, even in that moment of your doubt, that doubt can actually lead you closer to God. Often when I think of this idea of doubt, I think of the centurion who went up to Christ and he said to him, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." And hopefully that's the approach we can always take whenever we're struggling with whatever God's calling us to. If ever we're struggling with the mistakes we've made in the past, it's, Lord, just help me with my unbelief. Help me in this moment where I feel so down. And I truly believe that like God will never turn his back on anyone who's able to confess that, Lord, help me in this moment. I think that is exactly the moment where God is able to draw us closer into his presence to help us through that time of struggle. And so that's my hope for anyone who's listening to this, who was there for the message on Sunday, that you know that God is for you and that he cares for you.
Definitely something to think about as we go on this week. I don't remember what the topic is next week. Derek, do you?
I do.
Tell us.
We're going to talk about the fact that sometimes when we obey God, it doesn't get easier, it gets harder.
That's something we are going to probably be uncomfortable hearing, aren't we?
Yeah.
Well, you're going to want to listen in because it's going to be helpful. And listen, if you are a listener and you've got questions that are popping into your head, I believe you can ask us the questions, like send them to us. I believe it's forwardchurch.ca/ask us, I believe. So make sure you don't just sit on your questions and like hope I'll be like in tuned to you and we'll just be synchronized and I'll be thinking what you're thinking. Like ask us. This is what the podcast is here for. So you're going to want to tune in next week. Thanks for listening today and I hope you have a great week.